It was supposed to be a day of fun and excitement, a school trip to a remote nature reserve, far away from the chaos of the city. The students, a group of high schoolers, had been eagerly anticipating this day for weeks. Their teacher, Mr. Reynolds, had planned every detail, ensuring the trip would be an unforgettable experience. But no one knew that the trip would become something far darker, something no one could have predicted. The sun was shining brightly, casting a warm glow over the forest as the students arrived in their bus. They were giddy, chattering excitedly as they unloaded their bags and filed out into the sprawling green fields. Some students ran ahead, eager to explore, while others lingered, chatting in small groups or snapping pictures of the scenic view. Mr. Reynolds, a man in his mid-30s with a passion for history, stood by the bus, speaking to a couple of other teachers who had come along for the trip. Among the students was a tight-knit group of friends: Emily, a quick-witted and resourceful teenager, always ready for an adventure; Jake, the class clown, who could make anyone laugh even in the most awkward situations; Sarah, the quiet and observant girl who often kept to herself; and Ethan, the sports-obsessed jock with a heart of gold. They stuck together, laughing and teasing one another as they made their way to the park's welcome center, where their tour guide was supposed to meet them. At first, everything seemed normal. The trees around them were lush and green, birds chirped from the branches, and the air was fresh and crisp. The reserve was massive, with hiking trails, caves, and a nearby river perfect for swimming. It was the ideal setting for a school trip. The students split into smaller groups, some going on a guided hike, while others hung around to play games and chat. But as the day wore on, an unease began to settle in the air, a feeling no one could quite place. The weather had taken an unexpected turn. Dark clouds rolled in from the horizon, blocking the sun and casting a shadow over the forest. Mr. Reynolds, looking at the sky, suggested the group take shelter inside one of the cabins to wait for the storm to pass. As the students made their way to the cabin, something strange happened. The atmosphere seemed to shift, the world growing eerily still. The sound of birds and rustling leaves ceased as the air turned heavy. Jake made a joke about the weather, but it didn't land. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, sensing that something was off. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Inside the cabin, the group settled into a large, open room with rustic wooden floors and a stone fireplace. They gathered around a large table, chatting and laughing as the storm raged outside. It wasn't long before Sarah, who had been unusually quiet all day, stood up and moved toward the window. Her eyes widened, her expression turning from curiosity to fear. "There's something out there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The others turned to look at her, unsure if she was simply being paranoid. But as they glanced outside, they saw it. At first, it was only a figure in the distance, a shadow moving erratically among the trees. But as it drew closer, more figures appeared, stumbling, their movements jerky and unnatural. "What the hell is that?" Jake muttered, his usual bravado faltering as the reality of the situation began to sink in. One of the figures was clearly human, but something was terribly wrong with it. Its skin hung loosely from its bones, its eyes were wide and lifeless, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque, silent snarl. It was no longer alive in any way that made sense. It was dead. Another figure appeared beside it, then another, and then several more. The creatures, their grotesque forms shuffling forward, did not seem to notice the students inside the cabin. They moved in a slow, mindless fashion, their moans barely audible above the howl of the wind. What do we do?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly for the first time since the trip began. The group froze, unsure of what they were looking at, unsure of what to do next. Was this some kind of joke? Was it part of a survival exercise the teachers had set up to teach them a lesson? But when one of the creatures turned its head and locked eyes with Emily, all doubt evaporated. This wasn't a prank. The moaning grew louder as more and more figures shuffled toward the cabin. The group, now fully aware of the danger, scrambled into action. The doors were locked, the windows shut, but there was no mistaking it, they were trapped. There was no way out. Emily was the first to act. "We need to get out of here, now," she shouted, grabbing her friends by the arm. She looked around frantically. The storm outside was fierce, but they had no choice. They had to leave. But as the first screams rang out from outside the cabin, the group realized the real nightmare had just begun. They were no longer on a school trip, this was a fight for survival. The panic was immediate. A few of the students screamed as they ran to the back of the cabin, desperate for any escape route that might lead them away from the growing horde outside. Mr. Reynolds and the other teachers rushed toward the window, their eyes wide with disbelief. No one had ever imagined such a nightmare could unfold during what was supposed to be a relaxing school trip. "Stay calm," Mr. Reynolds ordered, trying to keep control of the situation. "We need to barricade the windows and doors. Everyone, move quickly." But the fear was palpable. Some students froze in place, unable to process what was happening, while others frantically scrambled around the cabin, searching for anything to use as a weapon. Chairs, tables, and even old wooden planks from the fireplace were repurposed as makeshift barricades. Emily, her heart racing, grabbed Jake's arm. "We need to help, now." She could see the terror in his eyes, the same terror that mirrored her own, but she didn't have time to acknowledge it. They were running out of time. Sarah, ever observant, was already moving toward the back of the cabin where a small door led to a narrow alleyway outside. "We can't stay here," she shouted, her voice shaking but resolute. "They'll break in soon enough." Ethan, who had been standing silently, staring out the window, snapped back to reality. "We need to make a plan," he said, looking at the group, his voice steady despite the chaos. "The door won't hold forever. We can't just sit here and wait." The first crash against the door sent the group into overdrive. The creatures were getting closer. One of the teachers tried to hold the door shut, but the pounding outside was relentless. Every second seemed to drag as the students and teachers scrambled to secure themselves. Outside, the creatures weren't just shambling, they were relentless, as if driven by some primal instinct. They growled low, inhuman sounds that reverberated through the thick wooden walls of the cabin. Their gnarled fingers clawed at the door, scrabbling for entry. "Look!" Emily pointed towards the trees. From the cover of the forest, more figures were emerging, their twisted forms barely visible in the shadows of the storm. They moved with increasing purpose, surrounding the cabin, blocking any possible escape routes. "Are they all like this?" Jake asked, his voice full of disbelief. "What happened to them?" No one had an answer. But the answer didn't matter anymore. As the pounding on the door grew louder, Mr. Reynolds' voice cut through the noise. "We're not going to make it if we stay here. We have to get to the vehicles. They're parked just up the hill." A plan was quickly formed, though no one could guarantee it would work. There was a faint hope that they could drive out of the reserve and get to safety. But the closer the creatures got, the less certain that hope became. The group gathered their things, trying to remain calm, though every noise outside sent a wave of panic through their veins. Sarah, who had remained near the back door, turned to the others with wide eyes. "They're getting smarter," she said, her voice low. "They're not just wandering anymore. They're hunting us." Emily could feel her stomach twist at the thought. The realization hit her hard, they weren't dealing with mindless zombies, they were facing something much more dangerous. The creatures were adapting. Mr. Reynolds moved quickly, gathering a few items he thought might help, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a crowbar. "Everyone, get ready to move," he instructed. "We'll go out through the back. Stay together, and don't stop running. Head for the vehicles." With adrenaline coursing through her, Emily nodded, already in motion. She grabbed Jake's hand, and they headed for the back door. As she passed Sarah, the two exchanged a brief, tense look. There was no time to speak. The door was groaning under the pressure from outside. The moment they pushed through the back door, the world outside seemed darker, the storm battering the landscape. The trees swayed violently, their branches creaking ominously. The path toward the vehicles was only 100 yards away, but in that moment, it felt like a lifetime. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of the front door splintering. The creatures were inside. Go! Go! Mr. Reynolds shouted as he broke into a sprint, leading the group down the narrow path. The others followed, their feet pounding against the wet ground, the sound of the storm masking their footsteps. Emily ran faster, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. She glanced behind her, seeing the first of the creatures spill out from the cabin's broken door, its eyes locked on them. Then, more appeared, shambling out from the shadows, their grotesque faces twisted in unnatural expressions. A scream echoed through the night, one of their classmates had fallen behind. "Keep going!" Jake yelled, but Emily could already see the figure behind them. It was too late for them to save anyone who couldn't keep up. The group reached the vehicles, their hopes rising as they saw the bus and the few cars parked along the edge of the hill. But as they approached, a horrible truth settled in: the vehicles weren't starting. The keys had been left inside the cabin. The sound of the creatures behind them grew louder with each passing second, the relentless moans echoing through the trees. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she and her friends reached the vehicles. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. The keys, the only thing standing between them and escape, were still inside the cabin, now swarming with the undead. There was no way to get to them without putting their lives in grave danger. Ethan, his face pale but determined, slammed his fist against the side of the bus in frustration. "We're trapped. There's no way we can get inside those cars with them coming after us." Mr. Reynolds, trying to keep a clear head, quickly surveyed the situation. The bus was parked at the edge of a steep hill, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The only possible escape routes were the narrow paths leading back through the trees, but with the horde closing in, every second counted. "We need to move. Now," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice steady despite the fear etched on his face. He turned to the students. "We can't wait for the vehicles. Our best chance is to head for the river. It's nearby, and if we can get there, we might have a shot at crossing to the other side." Sarah, always the most observant, looked at him with disbelief. "You want us to walk into the forest, right into the middle of that mess?" "Yes," Mr. Reynolds replied, locking eyes with her. "We don't have a choice. If we stay here, we'll be surrounded in minutes. The river could give us a way out." The sound of shuffling feet in the distance reminded them all just how close the creatures were. With no time left to argue, they quickly began moving, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The rain, now pouring down in sheets, made it difficult to hear, but the moans of the undead were unmistakable. They were close, and they were hungry. Emily and Jake led the way, their eyes scanning the trees ahead. The forest was dense, and the path was slippery from the rain, but it was their only option. The others followed close behind, their footsteps muffled by the wet earth. "Do you think we can make it?" Jake whispered to Emily, his voice shaky but trying to sound confident. Emily didn't answer right away. She didn't know if they could make it, but she had to believe they could. There was no other choice. "We have to," she said, gripping his arm tightly. "We don't have a choice." Behind them, the distant sounds of the creatures were growing louder. They had been noticed, and the hunt had begun. As the group moved deeper into the forest, the trees grew thicker, blocking out what little light remained. The storm continued to rage, the wind howling like a beast, pushing them further off course. But they couldn't stop now. "We need to find a place to hide," Ethan urged, his voice low. "We can't just keep running." Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the darkness. "We'll keep moving until we find a clearing or something we can use for cover. The river's close, but we need to stay out of sight for as long as possible." Suddenly, the underbrush behind them rustled. Emily froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The sounds of the creatures, once distant, now felt much closer. A low growl pierced the air, followed by a raspy moan. One of them had picked up their scent. "Run!" Mr. Reynolds shouted, his voice urgent. The group broke into a sprint, their feet slipping on the wet ground as they charged through the forest, their breath ragged in their ears. But as they ran, Emily felt a sharp pain in her side, her leg threatening to give out from the strain. She stumbled but caught herself, pushing forward with all her remaining strength. The others were just ahead of her, and the distance between them and the horde was narrowing fast. A scream echoed from behind them, a chilling, terrifying scream. Sarah had tripped. Emily didn't hesitate. She turned, grabbing her friend's arm and pulling her up. "Keep going," she urged, her voice a mix of fear and desperation. Sarah's eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded, her body trembling. The group had already made it a few more yards ahead, but now they were all at risk. The creatures were closing in on them, and with every step, they could hear the screeching, wet breathing growing louder. Then, suddenly, a figure appeared ahead of them in the trees, a tall, dark shape that stood still in the middle of their path. It was a person, or at least, it looked like one. "Who's there?" Mr. Reynolds called out, trying to steady his breath. But the figure didn't answer. And then it moved. In one fluid motion, the figure lunged toward them, a guttural scream escaping its throat. The students recoiled in terror as the figure slammed into a nearby tree, the impact sending a shockwave through the forest. The creatures had arrived. A burst of movement came from all sides, as more figures emerged from the darkness, their eyes glowing with hunger. There was no time to react. "Run!" Emily shouted, her voice breaking as she pushed Sarah forward. The group, now in full panic mode, turned and bolted deeper into the forest, the creatures in pursuit. They could hear the slapping of wet feet against the muddy ground as the undead closed in. But ahead of them, there was still a faint glimmer of hope, the river. The air was thick with tension as the group pushed through the dense forest, their lungs burning with each desperate breath. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a wave of panic through them. Behind them, the moans of the undead echoed, growing louder with every second. The creatures were relentless, their pursuit unyielding. There was no time to look back, no time to think. Survival had become a raw, instinctual drive. "Keep going!" Mr. Reynolds barked, his voice sharp and filled with urgency. His breath was ragged, but he pushed forward, urging the group on. Emily's legs were beginning to feel like lead, her body aching from the effort, but she didn't dare slow down. She could hear the others behind her, their feet slipping and stumbling through the wet underbrush, but they were all still moving. Sarah was close by, breathing heavily, her hand grasping Emily's arm as they ran together. The river was near. Emily could feel it in her bones, the distant sound of rushing water growing louder with every step. They were getting closer, but so were the creatures. She could hear them now, their guttural growls and shrill moans piercing the air, too close for comfort. "Is anyone else seeing this?" Jake's voice rang out, breaking through the chaos. Emily turned her head toward him, and for the briefest moment, their eyes locked. Ahead of them, a faint light flickered in the distance. At first, Emily thought it was just her imagination, a mirage in the chaos of fear and adrenaline. But as they drew closer, the light grew clearer. It wasn't a campfire or anything comforting like that. It was a set of headlights, cutting through the fog of the forest. The headlights of a car, moving in their direction. That's not possible," Ethan exclaimed, his voice a mixture of confusion and hope. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Could it be someone else? Could there be other survivors out here? "Get to the river," Mr. Reynolds ordered, not pausing for a second. "Don't stop, no matter what." But the headlights didn't seem to be moving. They were growing closer, but something about the stillness of the vehicle didn't sit right with Emily. Was it a trap? Had the creatures drawn them out? Or was this something else, something far worse? Before she could dwell on the thought any longer, Sarah screamed, pulling Emily's attention back to the immediate danger. The first of the creatures had reached the group. Its face, gaunt and twisted, its eyes glazed with hunger, locked onto Sarah, who was momentarily caught in place by the sight of it. "Sarah, move!" Emily screamed, grabbing her friend by the arm and yanking her forward. But it was too late. The creature lunged, its claws raking across Sarah's arm, drawing blood. She shrieked in pain, stumbling, but Emily held on tight, pulling her friend along as they broke into a sprint again. The sounds of the undead were closing in now, not just from behind but from all sides. The group was surrounded. The creatures' grotesque forms emerged from the shadows, their twisted bodies emerging from the darkness, their dead eyes fixed on their next meal. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears, but she didn't dare look back. Faster! We can't let them catch us. Jake shouted, his voice filled with panic. The group sprinted towards the river, their hearts pounding, their limbs burning. Ahead, the river roared, its waters crashing against the rocks in a violent surge. There was no bridge, no way to cross safely, not in this madness. But the river was their only option. The current was strong, and the water was dark and cold, but it was their escape. Their last chance. We need to jump. Emily shouted, her voice barely audible over the rush of the river. Jake, Ethan, and Sarah were right behind her, but Emily could see the terror in their eyes. They knew it was dangerous, they knew the risks, but they didn't have a choice. Do it now! Mr. Reynolds ordered, pushing the group forward. We'll swim across, find higher ground, and keep moving. We're not giving up. But as Emily took a step toward the edge of the river, something made her freeze. The light, the headlights, had moved. The vehicle was no longer stationary. It was coming straight for them. Her mind raced, her heart pounding as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The vehicle wasn't just a group of survivors, it was a predator. The headlights illuminated the trees, revealing a sleek, black SUV barreling down the narrow path towards them. Behind the wheel was a figure, a silhouette in the darkness, its face obscured. And following the vehicle, trailing behind in its wake, were several more creatures, lurching forward with an eerie precision. The figure in the SUV slammed on the brakes, sending dirt and debris flying into the air as it came to a halt just feet from the riverbank. Emily's breath caught in her throat. What the hell? The door of the SUV swung open, and a man in a black jacket stepped out. He looked disheveled, his eyes wide and wild. He didn't seem like a typical survivor. There was something unsettling about his presence, his very stillness in the chaos made her uneasy. Get in the car, the man shouted, his voice harsh, almost desperate. For a split second, Emily hesitated. The creature's moans were growing louder, and the river's roar seemed to drown everything else out. They were running out of time, but she couldn't bring herself to trust this stranger. Before she could make a decision, the first of the creatures leaped toward them, its claws reaching for Sarah. Run! Mr. Reynolds shouted, and without another thought, the group darted for the SUV, hoping they had made the right choice. The sound of the creatures was deafening as Emily and the others rushed toward the SUV. The rain hammered against the ground, blending with the shrill moans and growls of the undead that had nearly surrounded them. Sarah, her face pale and filled with terror, was the first to reach the car. She stumbled as she ran, blood staining her clothes where the creature's claws had torn into her arm. But she didn't stop. None of them did. Emily's heart raced as she reached the vehicle. The man in the black jacket had already opened the door, his eyes frantic but unwavering as he motioned for them to get inside. Without thinking twice, Emily grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her into the car, followed closely by Jake, Ethan, and Mr. Reynolds. There was no time to look back. The creatures were closing in fast, and the man in the driver's seat was already gunning the engine. Get in! Get in, the man shouted again, slamming his foot on the accelerator. The SUV lurched forward, the tires spinning wildly as it lurched away from the riverbank and into the forest. Emily threw herself into the back seat, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she tried to steady herself. As the car tore through the underbrush, branches scraping against the sides, Emily finally took a moment to look around. The inside of the SUV was a chaotic mess. The man at the wheel looked like he had been on the move for days. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt, and his eyes were wide, as if sleep had eluded him for far too long. Yet there was a certain sharpness to him, a danger that was both apparent and unsettling. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. The rest of the group had settled into the back seat, their bodies bruised and bloodied, but no one spoke. They were all too shaken to ask the questions that burned in their minds. The man's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his jaw clenched. Doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that I'm getting you out of here. Emily's chest tightened. She wanted to trust him, but every instinct screamed that something was wrong. He seemed too calm, too collected in a situation like this. And the way he had appeared out of nowhere, leading them directly to the SUV, felt more like a trap than a rescue. Jake, sitting beside her, glanced nervously at the man. You said we're getting out of here, but where exactly are we going? The man's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. There's a place. A compound. I've been trying to reach it for days. It's the only place left that's safe. They've been building it up. Fencing, security. They have supplies, everything. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. How do you know it's safe? And why the hell didn't you tell us sooner? The man didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, then to the side, where the headlights of the creatures could be seen flickering in the distance, their shadowy forms moving erratically through the trees. The group was still being pursued. I don't have time to explain, the man muttered under his breath. But if we don't move fast, we won't make it. The trees were rushing past them, the car swerving to avoid fallen logs and rocks in the road. The sounds of the undead grew faint for a moment, but Emily knew they couldn't be far behind. The man's speed was reckless, but there was an urgency to it that she couldn't ignore. Suddenly, a loud bang sounded from the back of the SUV, followed by a screeching metal noise. One of the creatures had caught up. Its rotting hands slammed against the back window, causing it to crack, the jagged lines spreading like veins through the glass. The thing screamed, its face twisted into an ugly snarl as it dragged its clawed hands down the glass. Hold on, the man shouted, his voice full of fury and panic. He swerved the SUV sharply to the right, sending the vehicle careening down a narrow dirt path that led deeper into the forest. The screeching outside intensified, but as the man accelerated, the sounds began to fade. They were losing the horde, but Emily knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Why aren't you telling us more? Sarah's voice, strained with pain from her injury, was weak but persistent. What's really going on? What happened to the world? The man's hands tightened on the steering wheel again. The world ended. You've seen it. The virus, the infection, whatever you want to call it, it's spreading faster than anyone realized. It's not just zombies. It's mutating. People are changing, the infected are getting smarter, more organized. It's a matter of survival now. Only the strong will make it. Is that why you're still alive? Ethan snapped. You seem pretty damn good at surviving, but what about us? What happens when you get us to your so-called safe place? The man shot a sharp look at Ethan, his face tightening. It's not like that. You'll have a chance there. But you need to understand, this isn't a game anymore. The people in charge, the ones who built this compound, they've been watching everything, waiting for survivors like you. Emily stared at the man, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to ask. Who were these people? What did they want with them? And why was he so eager to get them to this place? Before she could process more, the man's voice interrupted. We're almost there. Just keep your heads down. I'll get you to the gates. No matter what. As the SUV barreled through the forest, the group fell silent, the weight of the journey ahead settling in. They were alive, for now, but the dangers were far from over. The SUV screeched to a halt as the gates of the compound loomed in the distance. The towering, rusted metal fence rose high above them, cutting through the trees and creating a false sense of security. But Emily could feel it, the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. Is this it? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if afraid the words might summon something worse. She clutched her injured arm, her body slumped against the seat. The blood had stopped flowing, but the injury was still raw. The man at the wheel didn't answer right away. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed ahead, watching the security cameras mounted at the gates. They were the first sign of civilization in what felt like an eternity, but they didn't offer the reassurance Emily had hoped for. The compound looked abandoned, the high walls dark and imposing. It was almost as if no one had been here for years. Without a word, the man pressed a button on the dashboard, and the heavy gates began to slowly creak open. The sound echoed through the stillness of the forest, the metal groaning as it parted. A thick silence enveloped the group as they passed through, the SUV entering the compound and driving into the heart of what should have been their salvation. But nothing felt safe. As the vehicle rolled to a stop, Emily's gaze swept over the area. The compound was vast, almost too vast. Abandoned vehicles were scattered around the perimeter, some overturned, others rusting in place. A large building, which appeared to be the main facility, loomed ahead, its windows dark, its structure crumbling. There was a distinct sense of desolation here, a haunting stillness that left Emily uneasy. The man killed the engine and threw open his door. The group followed, stepping into the cold air, their breath misting in the chill. Emily hesitated before stepping out, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Was it possible that they had walked into another trap? "Come on," the man urged, his tone more insistent now. "You're not safe out here." They followed him across the compound, each of them weighed down by a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The buildings ahead appeared old, derelict, as if they had been built quickly with little thought for longevity. The door to the main facility was slightly ajar, and the man pushed it open, revealing a dark interior. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the faint smell of rot clung to the walls. It looked like this place had been abandoned for years, despite the freshly painted warning signs that read "Quarantine Zone." "No entry." "Where is everyone?" Jake asked, his voice trembling as he took in the scene. "Why does this place look like it's been left to rot?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he led them further into the building, his boots clicking against the floor. Emily's stomach twisted with anxiety as she followed, the silence growing unbearable. They reached what appeared to be a makeshift command center. A table was scattered with papers, old maps, and empty cans of food. Computers sat lifeless, their screens dark. But one thing caught Emily's eye, a single, flickering red light on a panel near the wall. It was the only thing that seemed to be alive in this forgotten place. The man stopped and turned to face the group. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I didn't bring you here to hide forever. There's no such thing as safe anymore. The people who built this place, they had their reasons. But they're gone now. They all left. Some ran, others died. I'm here because I'm one of the last few who still has a shot at surviving. And so do you." Emily's eyes narrowed as the pieces began to fall into place. "What happened here? Why is it just you?" The man's face twisted with frustration, but his expression softened as he took a deep breath. The people in charge, the ones who built this place, they didn't just try to survive. They were experimenting. Trying to find a cure. A way to fight back. But they went too far. And when it all fell apart, they left. Just like everyone else. But not me. I stayed because I knew there was still a chance. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes dark with suspicion. "A cure? You're saying this whole place was part of some experiment? And you're the only one left?" The man nodded. "There are things here you don't understand. Dangerous things. The virus, the mutation, it's worse than you think. The infected, they're evolving. And the people here, they knew that. They were trying to make something to stop it. And you're telling us that's why you brought us here? To what? Be part of your experiment?" Sarah's voice was sharp, her hand clutching her arm in pain. "No." The man's voice was a harsh snap. "I brought you here because I believe you can help. We need to survive, yes, but we need to be smart about it. The virus is mutating faster than anyone thought possible. And if we don't do something soon, there won't be anything left to save." Emily's mind raced, trying to process the flood of information. The compound, the experiments, the virus, it was all too much. But the way the man spoke, so matter-of-fact, like this was just another day, sent a cold shiver down her spine. He had survived for this long, but at what cost? Before anyone could say anything else, the loud sound of crashing metal echoed from outside. It was followed by a series of guttural screams. "Move," the man shouted, his eyes flashing with fear. "They're here." The sound of the crashing metal echoed through the compound, followed by the sickening, guttural moans that Emily had come to associate with the undead. The air in the room seemed to crackle with tension, as if the walls themselves were aware of the approaching danger. The man in the black jacket turned swiftly, his eyes wide, his breath shallow as he cursed under his breath. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "The infected are here, and they're not going to stop. This compound was supposed to be secure, but it's fallen apart faster than we anticipated. The others left before it was too late, but now we're on our own." Emily's heart raced. She glanced at her friends. Sarah was still clutching her arm, her face pale with pain. Jake looked around the room, his mind racing for an escape plan. Ethan stood at the back, his expression grim as he tried to make sense of the situation. "How are we supposed to get out of here?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're surrounded, aren't we?" The man nodded grimly. "Yes, but I know a way out. There's an underground tunnel system beneath this place, an old escape route used in case of emergencies. It leads to a secondary compound on the other side of the forest. That's our best shot at survival right now." Emily's mind raced as she processed his words. An underground tunnel? That sounded like their only hope, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole situation. The compound, the strange man, the sudden appearance of the infected, it all felt too convenient, like they were being herded towards something darker. "How do we know this tunnel will even be safe?" Sarah's voice was weak but defiant. "What if it's just another trap?" The man hesitated, clearly feeling the weight of their doubt. "I've used it before," he said, his voice low. "It's our only option. If we stay here, we'll be overwhelmed in minutes. The infected are smarter than you think. They know how to break in. But if we get to the tunnel, we can make it through. I promise." Despite the man's assurances, Emily still wasn't convinced. There was something about his story that didn't add up. How did he know so much about the compound, and why had he been the one to survive when everyone else had abandoned it? But there was no time for questioning. The moans of the infected grew louder, and the floor beneath them seemed to tremble with every footstep that echoed from the hallway. The man jerked his head toward the door. "Come on," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "We don't have time to waste. Move." They quickly followed him down the narrow hallway, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent building. The lights flickered above, casting strange, shifting shadows along the walls as they moved. Emily's mind raced as she tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the darkness, but all she saw were the shadows of their own movements. They reached a door at the end of the corridor, which the man quickly shoved open. Beyond it, a set of stairs descended into the gloom below. The smell of mildew and damp earth hit them immediately, and Emily's stomach twisted. It was the smell of decay, the scent of something long forgotten. "This is it," the man said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Stay close, and don't make a sound. The tunnel is only a few hundred yards. If we keep quiet, we should be able to make it through without being noticed." Without waiting for a response, he descended into the darkness, his footsteps soft but hurried. The group hesitated for only a moment before following. The stairs were steep, narrow, and slick with moisture, and Emily's hands gripped the railing tightly as they made their way down. The air grew colder as they descended, and soon they were plunged into total darkness. "Does anyone have a flashlight?" Jake asked, his voice sharp in the silence. Emily reached into her bag, feeling around until her fingers brushed against the cold plastic of a small flashlight. She clicked it on, and the beam of light illuminated the tunnel ahead. It was a narrow, concrete passage, the walls covered in thick layers of grime and mold. The air was damp and heavy, and each breath felt like it was being sucked out of her lungs. "Keep moving," the man urged, his voice coming from ahead in the darkness. "We're not safe yet." They moved forward in silence, the only sounds their footsteps echoing off the walls and the distant growls of the infected growing fainter but never fully disappearing. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, but the man knew the way, leading them without hesitation. As they rounded another corner, the faint sound of scraping metal reached their ears. It was a soft sound, but it was enough to stop them in their tracks. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The infected were close again. "We need to hurry," the man whispered urgently, his eyes wide with fear. "They found us. This is it." Emily's breath caught in her throat as the scraping sound grew louder, closer. A figure appeared in the tunnel ahead, pale, decayed, and moving with an unsettling jerky gait. It was one of them, one of the infected. "Go!" the man shouted, his voice breaking through the panic. "Run!" Emily didn't need to be told twice. She turned and sprinted down the tunnel, her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of footsteps and screams growing louder behind her. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, and with each step, she felt the darkness closing in. There was no way out. Not unless they ran faster, harder, and somehow made it out alive. The air was thick with the smell of death as the group pushed forward. And in that moment, Emily knew they weren't just running from the infected, they were running from something much worse. To be continued. The tunnel seemed endless, the darkness pressing in on them like a suffocating weight. Emily's lungs burned with each breath, and her legs ached with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let herself be caught. The sound of the infected behind them, their eerie, guttural growls, was growing louder, closer, and that only pushed them to run faster. The man led the way, his pace relentless, and the others followed close behind. Jake was out of breath, his body stumbling as he tried to keep up, but his determination kept him going. Sarah, pale and bleeding from her earlier injury, was slower, but she wasn't willing to stop. The group was close, but the infected were closing in too. Their moans echoed off the walls, bouncing through the tunnel, making it impossible to tell how far away they were. Almost there, the man called out, his voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. "Just a little farther." Emily could feel the panic rising in her chest. They had been running for what felt like hours, and the fear of the unknown had begun to take root deep in her gut. They had no idea what lay ahead, or if they would even make it out alive. They rounded another corner, and the tunnel widened into an underground cavern. The walls were damp, and the floor was uneven, but in the distance, Emily could see a faint light. It was a beacon, something that felt almost too good to be true. "We're almost there," the man yelled, his voice full of hope, as if they had made it. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man had been too calm, too controlled through all of this. Was he leading them to safety, or something far worse? The group moved forward, the light growing brighter with every step. As they neared it, Emily realized it was coming from a small, iron door at the far end of the cavern. The door was cracked open just enough to let the faint glow of light spill through, casting long shadows on the walls. "That's the exit," the man shouted, his eyes wide with relief. "This is the way out. Once we get through this door, we'll be safe." But just as they were about to approach, Emily heard it, faint, at first, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps behind them. Not just one or two, but a whole group of them. The infected. They were catching up. The man turned to look over his shoulder, his eyes dark with fear. He quickened his pace, pushing the group harder, urging them toward the door. "Hurry! They're almost here." Emily's mind raced. She wasn't sure if the man was leading them to safety or to a dead end. The infected were too close now. And if the man had been part of the experiments, part of the reason the virus had spread, could they really trust him? In the chaos, Emily spotted something in the shadows, a figure standing alone, watching them with cold, dead eyes. It was one of the infected, but different. It was taller, more muscular, its eyes too intelligent to be that of a mindless zombie. It was one of the mutated creatures the man had warned them about, the result of the failed experiments. "Wait!" Emily shouted, her voice trembling as she pointed toward the creature. "It's one of them. We can't go through that door." It's a trap. The man's face twisted with frustration, his eyes flashing with panic. We don't have a choice, he screamed. We need to go now, or we'll all die. The mutated creature snarled, its clawed hands scraping against the stone floor as it moved closer. The growls from the infected behind them grew louder, and Emily could feel the ground vibrating beneath her feet. There was no way out. Not unless they made a choice, and made it fast. The door ahead creaked open fully, revealing a small, narrow passage that led up to the surface. But Emily knew they couldn't outrun the infected. And she couldn't trust the man either. Come on, the man urged again, his hand outstretched toward the door. This way. In that moment, Emily's mind made up for her. She knew what she had to do. The others weren't thinking clearly. They were too scared, too desperate to realize the truth. Emily turned to them, her voice strong despite the fear gripping her chest. Everyone, listen to me, she shouted, grabbing their attention. The man, he's not telling us everything. We can't trust him. This place, the compound, it's part of the experiment. We're just more test subjects. Jake's eyes widened in shock, and Sarah took a step back, her injuries forgotten as the realization hit her. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. Everything, the compound, the experiments, the infected, he knows more than he's letting on. And if we go through that door, we might not escape. We need to think carefully about what we're doing. This is our last chance. The man's face turned red with fury. You think I'm leading you to your death? He spat. You don't understand. This is the only way. There's nothing left for you out there. But Emily didn't listen. She grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him back. We're going the other way. We'll find another way out. We'll fight our way through. Without waiting for anyone else to follow, Emily made a split-second decision. She turned and sprinted toward the opposite side of the cavern, where a narrow, dark passage led deeper underground. She had no idea where it would lead, but it was their only option. The man screamed after them, but his voice was drowned out by the relentless growls of the infected. They were closing in fast. Move! Emily shouted, urging the others to follow her. We don't have time to wait. They ran, the infected hot on their heels, but in that moment, Emily knew that the final choice wasn't about surviving in the compound, it was about choosing to survive on their own terms. And as long as they had each other, they had a fighting chance. To be continued. Or is it?